Welcome back to another video lecture. And in this lecture, we are going to continue our investigation of the progressive period. This time, we're going to look into the idea of politics and reform. And I think we have to start just briefly remembering that the middle-class professionals and intellectuals that made up the progressive movement really believed that all levels of government, national, state, and local levels of government had to become actively engaged in guaranteeing social justice and promoting the well-being of the people. Remember again the Constitution, in the preamble, it starts, "We the people, in order to form a more perfect union." And I think that's really one of the goals of many of the progressive reformers. And this time we're really going to look into the politics of the progressive period, something we really haven't talked a lot about. So also, I think briefly, we need to remember that the Gilded Age, roughly 1870 something to about 1900, was a period of rapid industrial growth and economic expansion that produced a great deal of opportunity and wealth. However, the wealth tended to be concentrated in the hands of a very small group of people, that led to issues such as the wealth gap, corruption, exploitation by the masses, and those are some of the things that we've been looking at kind of extensively. So why don't we get started here? In here you see in the picture a strong central government. I thought this image would be a good starting point for our idea of progress and politics. So again, the government is going to, in a sense, become the umpire. If you can think about an umpire, a referee in a sporting contest, it's really what the progressive reformers believe, and they place a great deal of value on that. And so that's what makes this period rather interesting, because prior to the progressive period, the different levels of government really kind of did not get involved. They were not that active, or if they were active, they tended to side with the interests of the wealthy and business owners. So let's take a look here. So one of the things we're going to look at in today's lecture is the emergence of charismatic political leaders. And you see two pictured here on the screen. Both of these men served as governors and then were U.S. senators. So you see Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, lovely hairdo on the left, and Hiram Johnson from California on the right. And when we talk about charismatic, that means that they have a lot of personality, they have a lot of energy, they have a lot of swagger. And so these political figures emerge from the state level, and then eventually, as U.S. senators, work their way to Washington. La Follette served 3 terms as the Wisconsin governor, and then he was in the Senate for 12 years as well. And he was very involved in promoting ideas and policies that we associate with progressive reforms. And so here, and you can see listed on the screen, I'll explain, one of his big things was the direct primary. And that's a process by which political parties actually hold elections to select their candidates for office. So now voters could actually weigh in on who they wanted to run for their political party. So you might think, well, that's really not a big deal. And it is, because prior to the direct primary, the political parties themselves selected the candidates for office. So often it was party insiders, party elites, people with social status, prestige, wealth, that were selected by parties to run for positions in national and state governments. And that took the people out of the equation. So the people didn't have a choice or a say in selecting their candidates. That's something we see now in our politics, and in fact, with the presidential election of 2016 on the horizon, there's a lot of talk about the early primaries that are going to be coming up. So that was a big deal, and states in the early 1900s began to use the direct primary, and that restores the idea of democracy and the voice of the people. Another thing that the progressive politicians promoted was revision of taxes, to prevent corporations from paying less in taxes than ordinary individuals. This is going to really become important once we have a national income tax that's going to come in a little bit under President Woodrow Wilson. The progressives believed in regulating railroads to protect small companies and farmers from unfair and uncompetitive practices of the large railroad trusts. They believed that regulatory commissions at the state level for health and safety needed to be staffed by experts, not political appointees who tended to be personal friends of political leaders. So you needed to have people with expertise, scientific training, staffing these regulatory commissions that were there to promote and protect the health and safety of the public. Think about the jungle and some of the conditions that Upton Sinclair described in that work of literature. The other thing that we see too that La Follette was involved in is the direct election of senators, and that is U.S. senators. Prior to this time, each state's legislature would select 2 individuals to serve in the U.S. Senate. So again, the public wasn't actively involved in selecting its own political leaders. So that was a limitation or a restriction of democracy, and that's something that the progressives are going to fix through the direct election of senators. And that's something, again, we take so many of these things for granted, we don't even think about them, but that's the point here, is looking at the impact that the progressive movement have. So we're going to then move on and then take a look at progressives and the states. So really following the lead of people like La Follette and Hiram Johnson, the states really become these laboratories. Think of science class and lab experiments. So the states become, if you will, these labs where different ideas and policies can be tried out, and that's kind of what happened on a really impressive scale across the United States. And so there's the map, and we have to remember that the United States is, in fact, a collection of states, and each state has its own state government, something we may tend to forget. So states are actively involved in promoting the idea of restoring democracy, promoting equality, protecting health and safety, and all of those types of things. So you can see a lengthy list here from factory inspection laws that, again, regulators would come in and make sure that factories had proper safety, fire, and sanitation in place. Again, think of the jungle and the awful description and conditions in which the people packaged food. So that was going to be one big step forward. There were state insurance funds for when workers got hurt on the job. Prior to state insurance funds, if a worker got hurt, they simply couldn't work, they lost their job, and they lost their wages, which really was a big deal and hardship for families that then fell into poverty, and there was no help. So state insurance funds are going to provide that help. Minimum age laws for work, in particular for children. And the idea was to limit work for children between the ages of 12 and 16 to prevent sort of the worst exploitation of child labor, and simply put, to let kids be kids and grow and mature and develop, so that they would not be stuck in factories for 12 to 16 hours a day. They also limited the number of hours of work. 12 to 16-year-olds who did work could only work 8 to 10 hours a day, whereas before they worked over 12 to 14 hours a day. So this is going to be a real benefit to young people. There was also limits on the hours that women could work. And while this was challenged in the Supreme Court in a 1908 court case known as Muller versus Oregon, and you should know that name, Muller versus Oregon, the Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of female workers. This is unique. For the first time, really, the Supreme Court sides with workers, not with the owners of the companies and factories. And women could only work 10 hours a day. And some might say, well, that's gender discrimination, and I suppose it is. However, women were considered to have a vital role in our society, that is, of bearing children and raising children. And if women were going to be absent from the home for more than 10 hours a day, that is, that was going to be dangerous and lead to bad results. So women can only work 10 hours a day. Old age security pensions. So what happens when people stop working? Well, prior to old age security pensions. They stopped working, they stopped earning money, and very often older people fell into poverty as even their own families could not help them out and provide enough financial means to keep them alive. So old age pensions are going to come up through the states and then eventually be adopted by the national government. And the last thing, one of the last things, is the Anti-Saloon League. Saloon is another word for bar. And there were a number of progressive reformers, in particular females, who launched a campaign to stop drinking, to shut down bars, to limit the consumption of alcohol, which was a long-standing practice in the United States. And why did the progressives feel that alcohol was a bad thing? Well, it led to, in some cases, domestic violence, absenteeism, men spending hard-earned money in saloons, that is bars, on alcohol, led to unproductive or ineffective workers. So the idea was we can make people behave better, we can make people morally better, we can make them more responsible by getting rid of alcohol. And eventually the efforts of the Anti-Saloon League, led by Carrie Nation and other women, led to the passage of what's known as the Volstead Act in 1918, which then becomes the 18th Amendment to the Constitution in 1920, which led to prohibition, and that is, it was illegal to manufacture, sell, or transport alcohol in the United States. So the Anti-Saloon League actually was very, very successful. And again, that started through the states, and again, women take an active role in this. Okay, so the other thing I did not mention here with regards to the states is states, especially those in the West, began to allow women to vote. Prior to this time, women did not have the right to vote, so they were excluded from democracy. This is not equal. This is not fair. And so progressive reformers, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and several other women whose names escape me at the moment, pushed and finally succeeded in passing what then became the 19th Amendment that allowed women to vote in 1920. So again, women at the state level agitate and work for improving society, improving equality, and improving democracy. All right, so we're going to go, forward here. And so we're going to look now at progressives and the federal level, and that'll be the last thing that we look at in this video lecture. What I want to remind you of is prior to the progressive time period, right? The federal government really didn't do much. It was inactive, or if it was active, it tended to side with the owners of business and wealthy people. The Supreme Court, also one of the three branches of government that you see listed there, pictured on the right-hand side of the screen, the Supreme Court also tended to side with business and wealthy people. Now, all that changed in 1901 when President William McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist who was upset about his plot in life, and Theodore Roosevelt, a vice president, sort of accidental. He was kind of stuck in the vice presidency by the Republican Party, who wanted to keep him out of the way, except they didn't realize that if the president dies, then this guy named Theodore Roosevelt, the vice president, becomes president. And as fate would have it, that's exactly what happened. So Theodore Roosevelt comes onto the scene in 1901, and he's a new force, totally new, dynamic, lots of energy, very charismatic, big, bold vision. Nobody had ever seen a president like this, maybe since the days of Andrew Jackson back in the 1820s and 1830s. So, and possibly Lincoln, I should mention. But at any rate, Theodore Roosevelt comes onto the scene, and he has a clear mission, and he wants to embrace the idea of progressivism to promote, again, better conditions in society, economic, social, political, and greater justice. And you can see this lengthy list of accomplishments under Roosevelt. In 1902, 1904, he attacks the railroad trusts, known as the Northern Securities. He gets Congress to pass the Hepburn Act in 1906, which regulates the railroads so that they are fair and competitive. In 1906, thanks to Upton Sinclair's jungle in large part, Congress passes the Pure Food and Drug Act to regulate food and drugs so that they're pure and clean and not harmful. Roosevelt ended a coal miners' strike, personally inviting the coal miners and the owners of the mine to Washington, and he mediated the strike and put an end to the strike, which supplied people with much needed coal for the winter. And this is a bold action by a president. He also got involved in the conservation of land for parks and management of natural resources. So we'll end on that. Thank you.